In the quiet fields of Ireland, long after the last hearth fire has burned down and the world is asleep, there are nights when the silence breaks. It does not break with the sound of footsteps or of animals stirring in the hedgerows. It breaks with a sound no one mistakes and no one forgets, a piercing, mournful wail that rises from the darkness, drifting over hills and valleys like the cry of grief itself. It is not the voice of any living woman, though it has the timbre of a mother's despair or a daughter's lament. It is a voice that belongs to a being who does not belong fully to this world. The Irish call her the Banshee. She is the harbinger of death, the spirit whose keening foretells the passing of a soul from the land of the living. And like the shadows of dusk, her presence has followed Ireland for as long as memory can reach. To encounter her is not the same as seeing a ghost or hearing a story told by the fire. Those who speak of the Banshee do so with a certain reluctance, as if words themselves carry danger, because her cry is not just a sound, it is a promise, a warning, and sometimes a sentence. Families who hear her lament know that death has drawn near. It might be the patriarch of the household, a child taken too soon, or a relative abroad whose life has ended. In every case, her voice reaches across distance, breaking down the walls of space to announce what cannot be avoided. The old belief held that she attaches herself to certain families, bound by bloodlines that stretch back into antiquity. When the O'Neills or the O'Briens or the Fitzgeralds lost one of their kin, it was said the Banshee herself would appear, weeping as though she too shared in the sorrow. She was both a curse and a companion, a frightening presence but also a confirmation that the departed had crossed into the other world with recognition. The earliest tales that survive speak not in generalities, but in concrete encounters. A woman drawing water late at night would hear a soft wailing at the edge of the field. A man returning from market would pause when he saw, on a distant hill, the figure of a woman with long streaming hair, combing it with a silver comb, and as she sang in anguish, he would realize the song was not meant for him, but for his kin, whose death would soon be at hand. Others described her as a small old woman crouched in a doorway, her red eyes swollen with tears, her cry breaking into sobs that no human voice could reproduce. Sometimes she was seen washing blood-stained clothes in the stream, a sign that those whose garments she tended were soon to die. These encounters vary in detail but remain consistent in one thing: she was never to be ignored. To dismiss her was to invite tragedy without preparation, but to heed her cry was to accept that the wheel of fate had already turned. The figure of the Banshee belongs to a world where death was not hidden away in hospitals or softened by euphemisms. In early Ireland, life was precarious, shaped by famine, disease, warfare, and the elements. Families lived with the knowledge that death was never far. The Banshee gave voice to that reality. She stood as the personification of mourning itself, but she also gave it shape and ceremony. When a person died, the tradition of keening was carried out by professional women mourners who would wail at the funeral, their voices rising in long, unearthly lamentations that mirrored the supernatural cry of the Banshee. In this way, folklore and reality overlapped. People who heard a keener might be reminded of the otherworldly spirit, and those who heard the Banshee in the night recognized her cry as the supernatural counterpart of human grief. This duality made her seem both terrifying and familiar, an uncanny echo of what every community already knew in its bones. Accounts of her presence are not confined to isolated stories. Written records from the Middle Ages describe her explicitly, connecting her to the noble families of Gaelic Ireland. Chroniclers noted that when great lords or warriors fell, their deaths were accompanied by strange cries in the night, cries that seemed to come from no earthly throat. The idea of a family spirit, tied by blood rather than place, resonated with a people whose clans and lineages defined their identity. The Banshee was not a general ghost wandering from house to house. She was a specific guardian of sorrow, attached to particular names, following them through the centuries no matter where they traveled. Even emigrants to foreign lands carried with them the stories of her cry, and tales persisted of Irish families in America or Australia who heard the wail of the banshee before receiving word of a loved one's death back home. Distance meant nothing to her. Where the bloodline went, she could follow. Descriptions of her form shift depending on who tells the story. At times, she is a radiant young woman with hair like golden fire, her beauty terrible and mesmerizing, her tears shining as she combs her locks by the riverside. At other times, she is a gaunt, withered hag wrapped in grey cloaks, her face weathered by centuries of sorrow, her eyes rimmed red from eternal weeping. And still others claim she appears not as one woman, but as many, a chorus of mourners whose cries fill the night sky together, blending into a sound that chills the blood. These transformations reflect an older truth. She is not a single ghost, but a figure of the other world, a being whose nature is fluid, able to take the form that suits the moment. The common thread is not her appearance, but her cry. That sound, described as piercing, inhuman, or unbearably mournful, is the essence of her being. Those who have claimed to hear it insist that it carries an emotion too deep for words, a grief so profound it belongs to no living mourner. Legends speak also of the dangers of encountering her directly. To approach her while she weeps is to risk being struck blind, or worse, to be cursed with misfortune. It was said that if a person found one of her silver combs lying in the grass, they must never pick it up, for it was bait left behind to lure the greedy or the curious. Those who touched it would find themselves seized by the spirit and dragged into her realm, never to return. These warnings may have served as cautionary tales for the living, but they also reinforced her supernatural authority. She was not a creature to be meddled with. She belonged to the thin veil between life and death, and her presence was to be respected, not exploited. The stories surrounding her begin to overlap with other figures of Irish folklore, particularly the washer at the ford. This spectral woman is seen at twilight, bent over a stream or river, washing blood-stained clothes. The garments belong to those fated to die in upcoming battles. Soldiers who saw her knew their doom was sealed, for she was cleansing their clothes in preparation for their death. In many regions, the washer and the banshee are one and the same, different faces of the same spirit. In others, she is a related being, a cousin among the host of the Aossi, the people of the mounds, who dwell in the hidden otherworld parallel to our own. The connection is unmistakable. Both serve as heralds of death, both take on female forms of sorrow, and both bridge the gap between human fate and supernatural witness. The washer reminds us that the banshee's role is not passive. She is not simply announcing a death, but preparing the ritual fabric of that death itself. The power of her cry lies not only in its role as omen, but in its resonance with cultural tradition. Keening was central to Irish mourning practices for centuries, and its sound was both feared and respected. Women who performed it were both necessary and unsettling, voices that could channel raw grief into public ceremony. The supernatural banshee amplified this practice into the mythic. Her cry was keening raised to a cosmic level, not for one household, but for the fate of a bloodline. She embodied the idea that death was not just a private sorrow, but part of a larger web of continuity, a reminder that lineage and ancestry outlast any single life. By attaching herself to families, she mirrored the way the dead themselves remained present in memory and story. Her lament was not only for the individual, but for the clan, marking the continuity of loss that shaped generations. As Ireland changed, so too did the stories of the banshee. With the arrival of Christianity, she was sometimes recast as a fallen spirit, an angel who had turned from heaven, but was not condemned fully to hell. Her cry was then explained as penance, an eternal mourning for her own fate projected onto the families she followed. At other times, she was demonized outright, her wail interpreted as a temptation or a curse meant to draw the soul into despair. Yet the older associations never vanished. The people continued to tell of her presence with respect, even when the official church condemned such beliefs as superstition. This tension between reverence and fear gave her story remarkable endurance. She could not be erased because she spoke to something deeper than doctrine, the universal human confrontation with mortality and grief. When we listen to the stories of those who claim to hear her, we notice a pattern. They do not describe the sound casually, as one might recall the cry of an animal or the whistle of wind. They describe it with awe, even when they are frightened. Some say it was the saddest sound they ever heard, others that it chilled their blood, but nearly all agree that it was unforgettable. This aligns with the symbolic power of sound in Irish tradition. Music, poetry, and lament were seen not just as art, but as forms of magic capable of shaping reality. The banshee's cry, then, was not simply a sign of death, but an act of power, the manifestation of mourning itself as a force that could reach across the veil. In her cry, the human and the supernatural converged, reminding those who heard it that death was not a private silence, but a cosmic transition. She stands, then, at the threshold of Irish imagination, half in the world of folklore and half in the lived experience of death. The families who claimed her presence did not do so in metaphor. To them, she was real, her cry as tangible as the tolling of a bell. But even for us today, separated by centuries, her story resonates. Because to speak of the banshee is to speak of the unavoidable truth that every life ends, and that grief, whether carried by human voices or given to a supernatural spirit, is the companion of mortality. She is not a monster to be slain, nor a demon to be exorcised. She is a presence, a witness, a voice crying in the night to remind us of what we would rather forget. The memory of the banshee is not just preserved in folk tales told by strangers. It is rooted in the oldest accounts of Irish families who believed her voice was theirs by blood right. These families did not speak of her as a wandering ghost, drifting from village to village, but as a constant presence that clung to their lineage, generation after generation. Her wail was an inheritance as sure as land, name, or crest. When a member of such a family lay dying, those who kept vigil might hear her lament outside the house, rising and falling like a wind that came from no natural source. If the dying were far away, on campaign or in exile, the family at home might still hear her voice, announcing the death before any messenger could arrive. In this way, she was tied not to place but to blood, her cry marking the invisible thread that bound kin across distance. The most renowned of these tales centre on Ireland's great clans. The O'Neills, kings of Ulster, were said to be accompanied by her cry whenever one of their lords passed. The O'Briens, descended from Brian Boru, Ireland's High King, were likewise attended by her spirit, and in their case the accounts speak not of one, but of several women who keened together, as though the death of a leader required a full chorus of supernatural mourners. The McCarthys of Munster, the powerful Fitzgeralds of Leinster, and the O'Connors of Connaught were all named among the noble lines to whom the banshee was bound. Her association with these families reflects how deeply she was linked with notions of sovereignty and prestige. To have a banshee was both a terror and an honour, proof that your family line was ancient, distinguished, and marked by fate itself. The idea that the banshee chose her families is crucial. She was not the voice of common death, nor did she herald the passing of every peasant or tradesman. She belonged to the aristocratic imagination, where the fate of a single individual might affect the fortunes of many. A chieftain's death meant not only the loss of a person, but the upheaval of leadership, the fracture of bonds, and the shift of alliances. For such monumental events, it was fitting that the supernatural world would take notice. The earliest written sources confirm this pattern. In the Annals of the Four Masters, compiled in the 17th century but drawing on much older material, chroniclers describe strange cries heard at night when kings or lords lay dying. The records do not label these voices explicitly as the banshee, but the resemblance is unmistakable. These laments are described as unearthly, sorrowful, and preceding the news of death. By the time folklorists began collecting oral traditions in the 18th and 19th centuries, the figure of the banshee was firmly established, and she was explicitly tied to specific families whose lineages stretched back to the Gaelic aristocracy. The continuity from medieval chronicle to modern folklore shows that she was never simply a tale told for amusement. She was an accepted feature of Irish cultural memory, woven into both historical record and living belief. But while her attachment to noble families is the most common thread, there are many stories of her cry being heard for those outside the great dynasties. Some of these may reflect how folklore spreads, with local families claiming a banshee of their own by analogy to the great clans. Others may reveal an older belief that her cry could be heard by anyone when death approached, and that her later restriction to noble lineages was a refinement of medieval imagination. In some stories, the banshee does not belong to a particular bloodline, but to a region, tied to the land itself. People of an entire valley might claim to hear her when one of their neighbors died. This suggests that the boundaries of her role were fluid, shifting with the needs and identities of the communities who told her story. Many of the oldest tales emphasize the shock of hearing her voice unexpectedly. A man traveling home at night might hear weeping near a hedge or an old fort, and upon returning discover that his father had died just at that hour. A woman fetching water might hear sobs by the river and find out the next morning that her cousin had been killed in an accident. These stories show how the cry of the banshee acted as a way of making sense of death at a distance, of giving it a supernatural announcement when no human messenger could have carried the news so quickly. In a world where information moved slowly, the cry explained how families seemed to know instinctively when a loved one had passed. It was not mere intuition, it was the voice of the banshee carrying the truth across the night. Her presence is often described in vivid detail in these ancestral accounts. For the O'Briens, she was seen as a stately woman in white, combing her hair with a silver comb and singing a dirge that could be heard over the River Shannon. For the McCarthys, she appeared as a bent old woman dressed in mourning black, wringing her hands and tearing her hair in grief. For the O'Neills, her cry came from the hills, echoing like a chorus of unseen mourners. Each family had its own tradition, its own inherited description of the spirit who followed them. These variations gave the banshee a kind of plural identity. She was not a single being, but a host of related figures, each bound to a different lineage, but all fulfilling the same role. This helped explain why her form and appearance could shift so drastically from one story to another. She was not limited by one image, she was many, and her many forms reflected the many lines of descent she mourned. Stories also tell of occasions when her cry was heard not for an individual, but for a group. During great battles, soldiers claimed to hear her wail before the fighting began, a sound that foretold which clans would lose their leaders before the day was done. In these moments, she was not simply a family spirit, but a herald of collective doom, her cry echoing over fields where blood would soon be spilled. Such accounts blur the line between the banshee and the washer at the ford, who likewise appeared to soldiers on the eve of death. But whether she was a lone mourner for a single lord or a chorus of grief for an entire host, her voice was always connected to the certainty of death. To hear her was to know that loss was imminent, and no human action could prevent it. Among the most persistent beliefs was that her cry was heard only by the family she followed. Outsiders might pass nearby and hear nothing, while those of the bloodline heard her voice keenly. This intimacy reinforced the idea that she was a personal spirit, not a general omen. She belonged to the family's destiny, and her voice was theirs alone to hear. Yet, in some stories, servants or friends in the household also heard her, drawn in by their closeness to the family's life. The limits of who could hear her were never fixed. The important point was that her voice carried the authority of kinship. She mourned not for strangers, but for those with whom she had an ancient bond. Her presence was not always unwelcome. Though frightening, she was also understood as a companion in grief. Families who lost a beloved member could take some measure of comfort in knowing that the banshee had cried for them. Her lament meant that the death was not ignored by the cosmos, that the sorrow of the family was echoed and magnified by the other world itself. This duality, fear and solace intertwined, is central to her role. She is terrifying because she heralds death, but she is consoling because she ensures that no death passes without recognition. In this sense, she embodies the paradox of mourning. The cry that breaks the heart is also the cry that allows grief to be shared. When Irish emigrants carried their traditions abroad, the banshee travelled with them. Tales from the 19th and early 20th centuries tell of families in America or Australia who heard her cry in the night, only to receive news days later that a relative in Ireland had died. Such accounts reinforce the idea that her connection was to blood rather than land. She crossed oceans because her bond was with lineage, not geography. For families far from home, her voice became a reminder of roots that distance could not sever, of a continuity of kinship that reached across the world. In this way, the banshee was not only a herald of death, but also a symbol of Irish identity, a supernatural marker of belonging that endured even in exile. These oldest tales, rooted in both oral tradition and historical record, show the banshee not as an abstract idea, but as a lived presence, feared and respected by generations. She was the mourner who could not be dismissed, the companion who arrived whether welcomed or not. To hear her was to step into the stream of ancestry, to feel the weight of lineage and the inevitability of loss. Her voice carried the memory of the past and the certainty of the future, binding families to their fate in a way that no other figure could. And as the stories continued to spread, the banshee's role deepened, intertwining not just with family, but with the very threshold of death itself. When people spoke of hearing the banshee, they rarely described her in the open fields or marketplaces of daily life. Almost always, her cry came at liminal times and places, on thresholds where one state ended and another began. She was heard in the last hours of night before dawn, when the boundary between darkness and light was at its thinnest. She was seen near doorways, windows, and gates, standing at the very edges of the household she mourned. Most vividly of all, she was said to linger at the deathbed itself, invisible to most but present in the air, her voice rising as the soul hovered between life and its departure. This association with thresholds, with the fragile space between one reality and the next, gave the banshee her power. She was not only a herald of death, but its constant companion, a presence that announced and accompanied the transition from this world to whatever lies beyond. Irish homes in the past were often small, single-room cottages with little protection from the sounds of the outside world. Families who kept vigil for the dying described the uncanny moment when the wailing of the banshee joined the weeping of human relatives. It was as though the other world itself had sent its emissary to add her lament to theirs. Sometimes her voice was heard just outside, rising from the lane or the hedge. Other times, it was described as echoing inside the very room, though no figure was seen. For those present, the effect was unforgettable. The cry signaled that the final breath was near, and that no matter how hard the living clung to the fading life, the passage was already sealed. In this way, she embodied the inevitability of death. She was the sound of the moment when hope could no longer fight against fate. Accounts speak often of the fear her presence caused, but fear was only part of the experience. Alongside terror, there was recognition. Families who believed in her did not hear her as a hostile intruder, but as a figure fulfilling her role. When the banshee keened, It meant the dying would not pass unnoticed. Her lament was an acknowledgement that death mattered, that it was being marked in both the human and the supernatural realms. In a world where mortality was constant and often sudden, the banshee's presence gave structure to loss. She was not a figure of cruelty, but of inevitability, a sound that carried the dignity of ritual even in the most impoverished or isolated homes. The language used to describe her cry is striking. It is rarely called a scream or a howl. It is almost always described as keening, the same word used for the ritual lamentations performed by women at Irish wakes. Keening itself was more than simple weeping. It was a structured form of mourning, a rhythmic wail that followed traditional patterns, combining grief with an almost musical cadence. Professional keeners were hired to perform this role, ensuring that the dead were properly lamented, their passage marked by voices that echoed through the night. The banshee was understood as the supernatural parallel to these human mourners. Where women of the community keened for the dead, the banshee keened for those who were about to die. She was the advanced voice of mourning, the lament begun before death had even arrived. In this way, she blurred the line between prophecy and ritual, between the future and the present moment of grief. Her connection to the threshold of death is further reinforced by her frequent association with water. Rivers, lakes, and streams appear again and again in the stories, places where she is seen combing her hair or washing blood-stained garments. Water is itself a liminal element, flowing between places, marking boundaries, and serving as a metaphor for passage. Just as rivers separate lands, the banshee's cry marks the separation between life and death. The washer at the ford, so often equated with her, makes this symbolism even clearer. By washing the clothes of those about to die, she participates in the ritual cleansing that accompanies transition. She is not causing death, but preparing the soul for its crossing, just as human rituals of washing and preparing the body would follow after death had occurred. The stream where she labors becomes the other world's threshold, and those who glimpse her there know they are witnessing the preparation of fate. The imagery of her hair, always long, often disheveled, and sometimes combed with silver, also reinforces her liminal status. Loose hair in Irish tradition was a sign of mourning. Women at funerals would often let their hair fall freely as a gesture of grief, abandoning the order of daily life to embody the disorder of death. The banshee's streaming locks, tangled or dripping with water, mark her as the eternal mourner. When she is seen combing her hair, she is enacting a ritual that belongs to both the living and the dead. The comb itself, shining silver in many tales, is another liminal object, a token that can cross between worlds. Those foolish enough to pick up a comb left by the banshee risked being drawn into her realm, trapped between life and death, as she was. Her hair and her comb are not merely ornaments. They are symbols of mourning, transition, and the dangerous pull of the other world. Inside the house of sorrow, the dying person is never truly alone. Even when family members are absent, the stories say the banshee is there, a keening surrounding the bed. In some accounts she is invisible, in others she manifests as a shadowed woman sitting near the hearth or crouched outside the window. One of the most enduring images is of her perched on a windowsill, peering in with eyes red from weeping, her voice rising in lament as the dying takes their final breaths. This image places her literally at the threshold of the house, the liminal border between inside and outside, between the family's intimate world and the wild beyond. Her role is to witness and to announce, to be both part of the vigil and separate from it. She never touches the dying, never intervenes in the process. She is not a psychopomp in the sense of guiding the soul, but she is the sound that frames the passage, the audible marker of its inevitability. The keening of the banshee could sometimes be heard days before a death occurred. This anticipation heightened her association with the threshold, for she marked not just the final moment, but the approach. Families who heard her lament might redouble their care for the sick, hoping to stave off the inevitable, but always with the knowledge that her cry was rarely mistaken. In this way, she served as a psychological preparation, a supernatural warning that gave families time to gather, to reconcile, to prepare themselves for the grief to come. While terrifying, this function also provided a strange form of comfort. The living were not caught wholly off guard. They were given time to brace themselves for loss, to accept that the threshold was near.
One of the darker elements of her role at the threshold of death is the way her cry blurred into the cries of those left behind. Families sometimes reported that they could not distinguish between the banshee's voice and their own mourning once death had occurred. Her lament was absorbed into theirs, or perhaps theirs into hers. This merging of human and supernatural voices reinforced her identity as the personification of mourning itself. She was not an outsider intruding on human grief. She was grief given form, the eternal echo of the sorrow every family experienced when a member passed. In this sense, she did not simply stand at the threshold. She was the threshold, the embodiment of the passage from life into memory, from presence into absence. There are also stories of her cry being mistaken for the voices of actual mourners. A man passing by a cottage might hear what he thought was the keening of women inside, only to learn later that no one had yet died and no lament had yet begun. It was the banshee he heard, her voice indistinguishable from the human rituals of grief. This confusion highlights her unique place between worlds. She was both supernatural and deeply human, her cry sounding like the voice of a mother, sister, or daughter, even as it carried the weight of fate. The house of sorrow was always filled with both kinds of voices, and the line between them could never be fully drawn.
As the stories continued to circulate, the banshee's role at the threshold of death became one of the most enduring elements of her identity. She was never far from the moment of passing, always ready to raise her lament when life gave way to death. Her presence made the household part of a larger cosmic ritual, linking the grief of one family to the eternal mourning of the other world. Whether perched on a windowsill, crying by the door, or wailing in the fields outside, she was always on the threshold, never fully inside, never fully outside, always in between. And in this liminal space, she gave voice to the deepest truth of human life, that death is not an end ignored by the world, but a passage that echoes, marked and remembered, with a cry no one forgets. The tales of the banshee are never limited to the quiet walls of a cottage or the hushed fields where families keep vigil. Her shadow stretches further into the world of warriors, battlefields, and the violent fates of men. In this realm, she appears not only as the wailing mourner at the deathbed, but as the washer at the ford, crouched by streams and rivers, washing garments soaked in blood. The figure is unmistakable, a woman bent over the water, pale hands scrubbing clothes that glisten with stains no human laundress would ever accept. The garments belong not to the dead, but to the living who are destined to die, their blood foreshadowed on the fabric before it has even been shed. To encounter her in this form is to know your doom. The soldier who sees her washing his own clothes has no escape from fate. No blade or armor can protect him, for she has already prepared him for the grave. This image of the washer at the ford is one of the oldest and most haunting in Irish tradition. Streams and river crossings were liminal places, thresholds between one piece of land and another. To meet her, there is to meet death itself, at the boundary of life. Warriors marching to battle might pass such a ford at dawn and hear the sound of sobbing, only to see her bent form, hair loose and dripping, garments piled at her side. When she raised her eyes to them, the truth became unbearable. Some accounts describe her as speaking their names, telling each man which garment belonged to him. Others say she remained silent, her gaze enough to seal their knowledge. A few stories even suggest that those who dared to approach and ask her questions could receive prophecy, learning not only that they would die, but when and how. The washer did not fight, did not strike blows, yet her presence on the battlefield was as decisive as any sword. She was the omen of defeat written in water. The connection between this washer and the banshee is intimate and unavoidable. Both are female figures who announce death through acts of mourning before the death has occurred. Both appear on thresholds, whether of households or of rivers. Both are bound to blood rather than chance, marking the fate of specific individuals. In some regions, people make no distinction between them. The banshee seen at the deathbed and the washer seen by soldiers are the same spirit, wearing different guises depending on where and how death is encountered. In other regions, they are treated as kin, sisters among the Aossi, different faces of the same otherworldly host. What unites them is the act of ritual preparation. The washer cleanses garments for death, the banshee keens in anticipation of it. Each represents the other world performing rites that mirror those of the living, ensuring that death is acknowledged both among humans and among spirits. The washer at the ford also deepens the association between the banshee and blood. Unlike the domestic keener, whose cries accompany natural death, the washer is bound to violence. She appears in tales of battle, of slaughter, of warriors falling in droves. The garments she washes are stained not by slow illness or old age, but by swords and spears. This is where her shadow overlaps with older goddesses of war and fate, particularly the Morrigan. The Morrigan in Irish mythology is the phantom queen who foretells battle and hovers over fields of bloodshed. She too can appear as a washer, cleansing the clothes of those about to die. In some myths, she meets heroes at river crossings, washing their armor while singing of their deaths. The resemblance is too close to ignore. The washer at the ford may be a survival of the Morrigan's role, a folkloric echo of the ancient goddess transformed into a spirit of omen. In this form, the banshee is not just a mourner, but a remnant of divine power, a figure who announces not only individual deaths, but the turning of entire battles. This connection to battle also explains the fearful awe with which men regarded her. To see her was not only to face your own mortality, but to recognize that death itself was written into the landscape. A ford where she appeared became sacred in its terror. No soldier who crossed it could feel secure. Her presence made the ground itself part of the machinery of fate, turning streams into places where the living glimpsed their destiny. The symbolism of water here is vital. Water cleanses, but it also carries away. The washer's act is both preparation and disposal, marking the soul for departure and sending it down the current toward the other world. Just as rivers flow inevitably toward the sea, so too does life flow inevitably toward death, and the washer at the ford is the figure who makes that truth visible. Encounters with her often left warriors shaken long before battle began. Men reported hearing her cry in the distance, echoing across valleys before a clash of armies. Others claimed to see her bending silently by the water, her pale figure glimpsed only briefly before vanishing. In all cases, the effect was the same: fear, resignation, and a sense that the outcome was already decided. The washer was not a negotiable spirit. She did not bargain, did not relent. Once she had taken your garments into her pale hands, your fate was sealed. Even those who tried to resist could not alter the prophecy. To draw a sword against her was useless. She was untouchable, an omen, not a foe. The only path left was to face death with courage, knowing it had already been marked. The washer's role also reflects the importance of ritual in Irish imagination. Just as human death required rites of preparation, so too did death in the other world. The washer performed those rites before the moment of passing, ensuring that the transition was orderly even when the human world was in chaos. Her presence on the battlefield meant that even in slaughter, the dead were not abandoned. Their garments were washed, their fate acknowledged, their deaths woven into the fabric of destiny. This gave her a paradoxical role. She was terrifying, but she was also necessary. Without her, death might be random, unnoticed, unprepared. With her, it was terrible but dignified, integrated into a cosmic order. The washer at the ford also appears in stories outside of battle, linked to individuals whose violent deaths were foretold. In these tales, she is seen alone, washing a single garment. A man might stumble upon her at dusk and recognize the shirt as his own. No matter how he struggled to avoid the fate, the story always ends the same. He dies in blood, his clothes stained exactly as he saw them in her hands. These stories reinforced the inevitability of fate. The washer did not cause death. She revealed it, and once revealed, it could not be undone. This made her one of the most dreaded of all supernatural encounters, for to see her was not only to face death, but to face the certainty of it, stripped of any illusions of control. Her presence in folklore endured for centuries because she embodied truths that were universal in a society shaped by war and violence. Ireland's history was filled with raids, feuds, and battles. Generations lived with the expectation that men would fall in blood, often far from home. The washer at the ford gave that reality a supernatural witness. She turned the inevitability of violent death into a ritualized moment, a sign that the other world was aware of the blood about to be spilled. For families and warriors alike, this was both horrifying and meaningful. It confirmed that death was not random, but part of a larger order, an order in which the Banshee and her kin played the role of heralds. By appearing in these violent contexts, the washer also expanded the Banshee's identity beyond the domestic. She was not confined to the cottage or the deathbed. She belonged equally to the battlefield, to rivers stained with blood, to the cries of armies facing their end. This dual presence, household mourner and battlefield washer, made her one of the most comprehensive figures of death in Irish tradition. She was the voice of sorrow in both private and public realms, the constant companion of mortality, whether in the quiet home or the clash of steel. To understand the Banshee fully, we must see her in both guises, keening at the hearth and washing at the ford, each role reflecting the universal truth that no life escapes death, and every death is witnessed by voices that transcend the living. In Ireland, the cry of the Banshee was never entirely separated from the cries of living women. To understand her, one must understand the practice of keening, the human voice raised in ritual lament for the dead. For centuries, death in Ireland was not marked by silence or by quiet prayer alone. It was marked by sound, long, piercing cries that carried far across fields and valleys, proclaiming grief to the community and to the other world. These laments, known as Cowinaead, were performed by women, often hired specifically for the task, who had the gift of giving shape to sorrow through their voices. They wailed, they chanted, they cried out the name of the deceased, weaving improvisation with traditional patterns in a sound that was at once musical and unearthly. To hear a keen was to feel grief made manifest, something beyond words, something that entered the body and unsettled the soul. The role of these women was not ornamental. They were essential to the proper honoring of the dead. Without keening, a death was incomplete, lacking the full recognition that society owed to the departed. The keeners ensured that grief was expressed openly, that sorrow was not hidden or muted, but proclaimed for all to hear. Their voices turned private loss into public ritual. The house of mourning became a place where the living and the dead were bound together by sound, and where the community joined in acknowledgement of the transition. This belief in the necessity of audible lament shaped the Irish understanding of death, and it is here that the Banshee finds her deepest human parallel. She is the supernatural keener, the eternal mourner whose cry precedes and accompanies death, just as human keening follows it. Accounts of keening describe its structure in detail. It was not random crying, but a performance with rhythm and cadence, often improvised yet bound by traditional motifs. Women would begin with high-pitched wails that rose and fell in waves, then move into verses that recounted the deeds of the deceased, their lineage, their virtues, and even the injustices they had suffered. The lament became a kind of oral biography, a way of inscribing memory into sound. Between verses came cries, sobs, and refrains, the voice breaking like the grief it embodied. To those who listened, it was more than performance. It was catharsis, the collective release of sorrow through sound too raw to be contained in ordinary speech. It is little wonder, then, that people described the banshee's cry in the same terms. Her wail was said to have the exact quality of keening, the same rise and fall, the same unbearable sorrow. The difference was that she keened before death, while human women keened after. This inversion gave her cry its uncanny power. She was mourning a life not yet gone, anticipating the grief that others would soon express. Her cry was both prophecy and lament, collapsing the boundary between future and present. Families who heard her were already grieving, because she had voiced the loss before it had occurred. In this way, the banshee and the keening women formed two halves of the same tradition, one human, one supernatural, together ensuring that no death passed without the proper sound of sorrow. The importance of keening also explains why the banshee was always female. In Irish tradition, women were the guardians of mourning. They were the ones who wept, who sang, who tore their hair and beat their breasts at funerals. Their grief was not restrained but embodied, visible and audible. Men might dig the grave or carry the coffin, but it was women who gave voice to the sorrow. The banshee carries this role into the other world, a spirit defined not by sword or curse but by voice. Her power lies in sound, and that sound belongs to the feminine sphere of ritual mourning. To imagine a male figure keening would have broken cultural expectation. The banshee was believable precisely because she extended a role that already existed, magnifying it to supernatural scale. Folklorists collecting keening songs in the 18th and 19th centuries noticed how closely they resembled descriptions of the banshee. Both were filled with references to ancestry, lineage, and the inevitability of death. Both used cries and wails that defied simple notation. Both evoked a sense of the uncanny. Some scholars even suggested that the banshee herself might have originated as a memory of keeners heard in the distance, their cries mistaken for supernatural voices in the night. Others argued the opposite, that keening women were imitating the cry of the banshee, shaping their performance to mirror the supernatural model. Either way, the two are inseparable. The living keeners and the spirit keener reflect one another, each giving credibility and weight to the other. The presence of professional mourners also explains why the banshee was not always regarded with hostility. Just as families welcomed keeners to ensure their dead were properly lamented, they accepted the banshee's cry as part of the order of death. To be without her was sometimes considered worse than to hear her. A family with no banshee might be seen as lacking ancient lineage without the supernatural acknowledgement of their grief. By contrast, a family with a banshee, though frightened by her cry, could take pride in knowing that their sorrow mattered to more than themselves. The keening women gave ritual voice to human grief, while the banshee gave cosmic voice to the inevitability of mortality. Both provided recognition, and recognition itself was a form of comfort. The church often disapproved of keening, condemning it as pagan excess, filled with improvised verses that sometimes criticized landlords or spoke of old gods. Priests urged silence, prayer, and dignity, while keening women continued their practice in defiance. The banshee, too, was condemned as superstition, her cry attributed to demons or fallen spirits. Yet neither practice disappeared. The people clung to them because they served needs that official religion did not satisfy. The human need to give grief a voice, to scream, to cry, to proclaim loss in sound, was too deep to be erased. And in this persistence, the banshee remained as powerful as ever. Her cry carried not just terror, but validation. She was the eternal keener, the one no priest could silence, the one no family could forbid. The stories of keening women reveal that grief in Ireland was never silent. It was a communal act, given form by voices that carried across the night. The banshee embodied this tradition, taking the human cry of mourning and extending it into the realm of fate. Together, the women of the community and the spirit of the other world ensured that death was always acknowledged, never hidden, always voiced. To live in Ireland was to know that when death came, the night would not be quiet. It would be filled with the sound of lament, human and supernatural, mingling, indistinguishable, the voices of grief rising together to mark the threshold of life and death. The banshee has never worn a single face. Across the stories, she appears as young or old, beautiful or dreadful, radiant or ghastly. Sometimes she is a solitary figure glimpsed in the shadows of a hedge. Sometimes she is one among a host, a chorus of voices keening in unison. This fluidity of form is not a weakness in the tradition, but one of its strengths. It reveals how the Irish imagination understood death itself, not one thing, not one face, but many. Like the banshee, death can arrive as a sudden shock, a gentle passing, or a long, weary decline. Her shifting appearances capture this truth, embodying every possible mask that mortality might wear. One of her most enduring forms is that of the crone. In this guise she is small, bent and withered, her face wrinkled, her eyes red from endless weeping. She wears a dark cloak, sometimes grey, sometimes black, and her hair hangs in matted tangles. She crouches at windows, lurks by doorways, or is seen hobbling through the fields at dusk. This image reflects the traditional association of age with mourning and wisdom. Old women were often the keeners at wakes, their long experience giving them authority to voice grief. The banshee as crone is the eternal mourner, aged by countless deaths, her body bent beneath the weight of centuries of sorrow. To see her in this form is to recognize the inevitability of death as part of the long cycle of life. She embodies the truth that age brings loss, and that grief, like wrinkles and weariness, is part of human fate. Yet the stories also speak of her as a maiden, radiant and young, with long flowing hair and eyes that shine like stars. In this form, she appears by rivers or beneath trees, combing her hair with a silver comb, her beauty mesmerizing even as her wail chills the heart. This vision of the banshee is striking because it contrasts so completely with her role as a herald of death. Why should a being tied to mortality wear the face of youth? The answer lies in the symbolism of life cut short. The maiden form of the banshee is the image of beauty destined to fade, vitality doomed to be extinguished. She is not merely death as decay, but death as interruption, the sudden end of promise and potential. For young men who encountered her, this form was especially frightening. To see death wearing the face of youth was to confront the fragility of their own lives, the possibility that death could come not only at the end of a long journey, but in the very midst of it. There are also accounts of her appearing as a motherly figure, neither old nor young, but in her full maturity, clad in white or green, her eyes swollen with tears. This form connects her to the archetype of the maternal mourner, the woman who laments for her children. Many families who claimed a banshee described her as if she were part of the household itself, a spectral matron who wept for each passing as though the dead were her own kin. This form may reflect the way grief was seen as a maternal responsibility in human life. Mothers, sisters, and daughters bore the heaviest burden of mourning, their cries shaping the wake and the funeral. The banshee as mother is the supernatural extension of this role, the eternal woman of the household who never ceases to grieve. These shifting identities, crone, maiden, mother, suggest that the banshee is not a single individual at all, but a role played by the other world. Just as different women in the community might take turns keening, so too might different spirits take turns appearing as the banshee. This explains why her appearance varies so widely from family to family. To the O'Briens, she may have appeared as a radiant maiden. To the O'Neills, as a stooped old woman. To the McCarthys, as a sorrowful matron. Each family preserved its own memory, and over time these memories merged into a figure with many faces. Rather than contradicting one another, they reveal her universality. She could be old, young, or ageless, because death itself wears all faces. Some traditions even multiply her presence, describing not one banshee but several. The O'Briens were said to have a host of them, keening together on the death of a lord, their cries rising in dreadful harmony. In such tales, the banshee becomes not an individual, but a chorus, the embodiment of collective mourning. Just as keening women often performed in groups, blending their voices into a single tide of lament, so too did the banshees appear as a company. This vision elevates her from a solitary omen to a force of nature, the sound of many voices announcing that death has entered the world. Her phantom aspect deepens the sense of uncertainty. At times, she is described not in human terms at all, but as a shifting shadow, a mist that takes vague shape, a pair of glowing eyes in the dark. In these accounts, the emphasis is not on her appearance, but on her sound. The cry comes first, and only later does the witness realize that there is no solid figure behind it. She is more voice than body, more presence than form. This aligns with her essence as the embodiment of mourning itself. Grief is not seen, it is heard, and so the banshee, when reduced to her purest form, is nothing more than a wail carried on the wind. The multiplicity of her faces also reflects deeper mythological patterns. In Celtic tradition, many supernatural women appear in triple form: maiden, mother, and crone. This triad echoes through European folklore as the archetypal cycle of life, fertility, and death. The banshee's shifting identities fit neatly into this framework. She is the maiden who mourns the death of youth, the mother who weeps for her household, and the crone who embodies the finality of age. Whether she appears as one or as all three, she completes the cycle, reminding mortals that death attends every stage of life. In this sense, she is not only a herald of death, but a mirror of existence itself. What is remarkable is how ordinary people accepted these contradictions. No one worried that the banshee was sometimes young, sometimes old, sometimes many. Folklore is not bound by consistency. Its power lies in its flexibility, in its ability to reflect the many faces of reality. Death is not simple, and so the banshee is not simple. She wears whatever form conveys the truth of the moment, whether that truth is decay, interruption, or maternal sorrow. Her many faces are not a flaw, but the essence of her identity. She is not one spirit among others, but the mask worn by death whenever it comes to the threshold. Among the many details preserved in Irish lore about the banshee, one of the most persistent is her attachment to certain families. Unlike other spirits who haunted places, ruins, or stretches of lonely countryside, she was said to cling to bloodlines, moving wherever the descendants of that line carried their name. It was not the walls of the homestead that bound her, but the flow of ancestry itself. She was less a local ghost than a herald of lineage, her cry echoing across centuries for those who traced their blood back to the noble houses of Ireland. The most famous of these were the great Gaelic clans whose names filled the annals of history: the O'Neills of Ulster, the O'Briens of Munster, the O'Connors of Connaught, the McCarthys of Desmond, and the Fitzgeralds of Leinster were all named as families who had their own banshee. She was spoken of almost like a heraldic emblem, not carved into shields or stitched onto banners, but audible in the night when death came to claim one of their kin. These families, known for their long genealogies, wars, and shifting alliances, believed their greatness carried a supernatural witness. To be marked by the Banshee was at once a burden and an honor. It meant that your family's sorrow was recognized not only by neighbors, but by the other world itself. Her loyalty to families rather than places may reflect the deep importance of kinship in Gaelic Ireland. In a society where land ownership was collective and authority flowed through extended clans, identity was bound not to where you lived, but to who your ancestors were. The Banshee mirrored this truth. She was not the guardian of a castle or the ghost of a battlefield. She was the mourner of kin, as bound to family names as to individuals. When those names moved, through exile, migration, or conquest, she moved with them. There are stories of Irish families in far-off lands hearing her cry on the very night a relative died back in Ireland. The oceans did not separate her from her duty. Blood was the cord that tied her, and wherever it led, she followed. This exclusivity gave rise to a belief that not every family had a banshee. The humbler classes might hear her voice from afar, but rarely claimed her as their own. In many versions of the tradition, only the old noble houses had the honor of her lament. The implication was clear. Ancient lineage attracted supernatural recognition, while newer or less distinguished families passed in silence. Some storytellers went further, suggesting that a family's banshee was proof of its royal or heroic descent. Her cry was evidence of legitimacy, a supernatural seal confirming that the bloodline carried weight in the eyes of both men and spirits. In this way, the banshee became not just a figure of folklore, but a marker of social status, a voice that reinforced the divisions of class and ancestry. There were exceptions, of course. Some families of humbler standing insisted they too were followed by a banshee, pointing to occasions when her wail had been heard at their door. These claims may reflect older traditions where the banshee belonged to everyone before her image was refined into a herald of aristocracy. Or they may show how families sought to elevate their own prestige by associating themselves with the supernatural mourner of kings. Either way, the association between the banshee and noble blood became so strong that it shaped how later generations understood her. She was not the spirit of every home, but the herald of ancient blood. The stories of noble lineages often describe her in forms befitting the family's grandeur. For the O'Briens, she was a beautiful woman in white, combing her hair beside the river Shannon, her cries rising like the sound of wind through reeds. For the McCarthys, she appeared as a dark, stooped hag who shrieked on the hills of Desmond. For the Fitzgeralds, she was said to come in groups, a host of wailing women whose cries filled the night air when a lord of that house was about to die. Each family carried its own memory of her, passed down in tales as carefully as coats of arms. She was at once terrifying and familiar, part of the inheritance of a name. Her loyalty to families also served a practical function in storytelling. Death in noble households was never a private matter. The passing of a lord meant disputes over succession, shifts in alliances, and upheaval in land and power. It was an event of communal consequence, one that demanded recognition. The banshee's cry gave that recognition a supernatural weight. It was not only the clan or the kingdom that acknowledged the loss, but the very spirits of the other world. Her presence framed the death as part of a larger cosmic order, an order where noble blood was marked and remembered. The idea that she followed families across borders was especially powerful in the age of migration. During the 17th and 18th centuries, when war, famine, and persecution drove many Irish abroad, tales spread of the banshee's cry being heard in foreign lands. Families in Spain, France, or America claimed to hear her lament just as vividly as in Ireland, often at the very hour a relative died across the sea. These stories reinforced the belief that she was bound not to soil, but to lineage. For exiled families, her cry was both a terror and a comfort. It meant that even far from home, They remained connected to their ancestral identity, their deaths marked by the same voice that had mourned their ancestors for generations. There are darker elements to this attachment as well. Some families claimed that their banshee did not only wail in sorrow, but shrieked in anger when dishonor befell the clan. A lord who betrayed his kin or broke his oaths might hear her cry not as lament but as accusation, her voice filled with fury, as though the other world itself judged him. In this way, the banshee was not merely a mourner, but a moral witness, a spirit who measured not just the fact of death, but the worthiness of the life that had ended. Such stories added weight to the responsibilities of noble blood. To be of ancient lineage was to be mourned by the banshee, but it was also to be held to account by her. Folklorists who studied these traditions often noted the similarities with other European beliefs in family spirits. In Scotland, the Caoineag, or wailing woman, performed much the same role, attached to specific clans. In Wales, certain families claimed to hear a disembodied lament before death. Across Europe, noble lineages were marked by omens, as though ancestry itself attracted supernatural attention. The Irish banshee stands out among these for her vivid detail, her many faces, and the deep cultural role she played. Yet her exclusivity to families of note links her to a broader human tendency to connect power, prestige, and fate. The families she followed carried her like a shadow. Her cry became part of their identity, something both dreaded and respected. To belong to such a lineage meant living with the knowledge that death would never come silently. It would always be heralded by a voice from the other world, a voice that reminded them of their place in a chain stretching back centuries. For all the terror of her wail, there was dignity in it as well. She was proof that the family mattered, that their losses echoed beyond the grave, carried on a cry that no time or distance could silence. The banshee is never fully of the living world, nor entirely of the dead. She belongs to the in-between, and it is in this liminal space that her power resides. Every account of her cry, whether at a cottage door or by a lonely ford, emphasizes this quality of being caught between two realities. She is not the one who kills, nor the one who buries. She does not cause death, nor does she comfort after it has happened. Instead, she hovers in the threshold, voicing grief before the final breath, sounding a lament before the body has grown cold. Her cry marks the exact moment when life begins to slip away and death begins to claim its place. This role as a threshold figure explains why her presence is so uncanny. People who have spoken of hearing her describe the sound as neither entirely human nor entirely other. It carries the tone of a woman's wail, but layered within it is something sharper, stranger, a quality that unsettles even those who are used to mourning. It is as though her voice stretches across two worlds at once, resonating with grief that belongs to the living and to the dead simultaneously. Those who hear it cannot ignore the feeling that she is calling not just for one person, but for the very passage itself, giving sound to the transition that every soul must make. Folklore often places her at physical boundaries, reinforcing this liminality. She is seen at crossroads, rivers, windows, and doorways. Each of these is a place where one space becomes another, where movement is possible, but not yet complete. Crossroads have long been linked with the supernatural in Ireland as meeting points of paths where spirits linger. Rivers mark the border between territories, their waters flowing like the line between life and afterlife. Windows and doors mark the entry and exit points of the home. The banshee's preference for these places shows her role as a guardian of thresholds, a presence that waits at the crossing point between one state and the next. The cry itself can be understood as a liminal sound. Unlike speech, which communicates in words, or song, which follows melody, keening exists somewhere between the two. It is structured but untranslatable, filled with meaning yet beyond literal interpretation. To hear it is to know that something has been communicated, but not in the language of the waking world. This makes it a perfect expression of the liminal moment of death. The dying can no longer speak in the ordinary sense, and the dead have not yet been committed to memory. The banshee's cry fills this silence with a sound that is neither here nor there, an in-between voice for an in-between state. Some stories describe her as appearing days before the death she heralds, others only in the hours immediately preceding it. This variability mirrors the unpredictable nature of dying itself. Sometimes the approach is slow and visible, sometimes sudden and shocking. The banshee can accommodate both, sounding her lament as soon as fate is sealed, whether that seal comes early or at the last possible moment. In this way she is never late, never mistaken. She arrives exactly when the passage has become inevitable, her cry the signal that the liminal moment has begun. Her association with twilight hours also strengthens her identity as a liminal figure. Many accounts place her appearance at dusk or dawn, those in-between times when day becomes night or night becomes day. Just as death is the transition between life and its absence, twilight is the transition between light and dark. To hear her cry at such hours is to feel the weight of layered thresholds, the daily cycle echoing the eternal one. The Irish imagination, so attuned to the symbolism of nature, made sense of death through these rhythms, and the banshee embodied them perfectly. She is also linked to the Sea, the people of the mounds, whose world lies alongside ours but out of reach. The banshee moves between the two realms, visible and audible at moments of crisis, but otherwise unseen. Her cry is a signal of her crossing, a sound that bridges the worlds for a brief instant. Those who hear her are not just warned of death, but momentarily reminded of the nearness of the other world. She is proof that the boundary is not solid, but porous, that at the moment of death, the two realities touch, and through that contact, the voice of the banshee is heard. The liminal nature of her cry also explains the intense reactions it provokes. People report feelings of dread, awe, despair, or even a strange sense of acceptance. The sound strips away ordinary defenses, forcing the listener to confront mortality. This is what makes it so terrifying, its ability to pierce the illusions of safety that the living cling to. Yet it also carries a certain mercy, because it prepares the heart. Families who hear it know that the end is near, and while they may fear it, they are not caught entirely unawares. The cry offers no escape, but it offers recognition, and recognition is its own kind of gift. By existing between life and death, the banshee avoids being defined as wholly benevolent or wholly malevolent. She is not a monster who takes lives, nor a saint who saves them. She is a witness, and witnesses are neutral. Her lament is impartial, sounding for the virtuous and the wicked alike. This neutrality is part of what makes her frightening. She does not judge, she does not choose, she does not plead, she simply announces. Her cry is the sound of inevitability, and inevitability has no bias. This liminal essence also gives her a universality that extends beyond any single family or story. Every culture must face the threshold of death, and in Ireland, it was the banshee who gave it a voice. Her many faces, her attachment to noble bloodlines, her presence in homes and battlefields, all of these rest on the foundation of her role as a liminal figure. She is the herald of crossing, the voice of transition, the sound that belongs not to life, not to death, but to the instant when one becomes the other. To speak of the banshee is to speak of the world she comes from, because she is never simply a wandering ghost. She is part of something older and deeper, the great network of spirits and beings that the Irish called the Sea, the people of the mounds. To understand her cry, her presence and her power, one must step into that other world where she belongs, a realm that runs parallel to our own, unseen but always near. The Sea are rooted in Ireland's landscape. The very earth is said to be theirs. Ancient burial mounds, ring forts, and grassy hills scattered across the island are described as their dwellings. To disturb these places was to risk their wrath, for they were not ruins of the past, but doorways into another realm. Farmers avoided cutting certain bushes or leveling certain rings, knowing the sea lived there. The belief was that their world lay just beneath the surface of ours, invisible unless they chose to let it be seen. Streams, caves, and hollow hills were all thought of as thresholds where the two realms brushed against each other. The Banshee, always seen at such boundaries, belongs naturally among them. She is one of their number, a being who slips between the worlds to bring her lament into ours. The Aossi are often thought of as fairies, but this word does not capture their depth. They are not tiny winged sprites, but a race of beings with power, dignity, and danger. In some traditions, they are the remnants of the Tuatha De Danann, the ancient gods of Ireland, who retreated into the hills when defeated by mortal men. If this is true, then the Banshee is not merely a spirit of mourning, but a descendant of divine blood, a transformed goddess whose role has shifted into folklore. Her cry, then, carries not only grief, but the echo of divinity, a sound that recalls the older days when gods walked openly in the land. Within the host of the Aossi, the Banshee occupies a particular place. She is not a trickster or a warrior, nor one who lures mortals away with promises. She is a mourner, a herald, a voice that speaks only of death. But this does not make her lesser. In the other world, as in ours, death has its own rituals, its own guardians. Just as the living employ keening women to mark a passing, so too does the other world send its emissary. The Banshee is that emissary, the one who ensures that death is recognized in both realms. Her cry is the Aossi acknowledging human mortality, a recognition that ties the two worlds together in sorrow. The belief in the Aossi also explains her shifting forms. Otherworldly beings were never bound to one appearance. They could be radiant or dreadful, kind or cruel, depending on how they chose to manifest. This fluidity of form is one of the hallmarks of the sea, and the Banshee shares it fully. To some, she comes as a withered hag, to others as a shining maiden. These are not contradictions, but reflections of the other world's nature, where identity is fluid and appearance is shaped by meaning rather than biology. She is always a mourner, but the face she wears depends on the truth she is voicing. The other world of the Aossi was not imagined as distant or unreachable. It was always near, accessible through hidden paths, sudden shifts in perception, or the thin places in the land. Death was the surest way to enter it, but not the only way. People spoke of travelers who stumbled upon a hill at twilight and found themselves in a hall of music and light, only to emerge hours later and discover that years had passed. Others told of being lured into mounds by music, only to vanish forever. In such a world, the presence of a figure like the Banshee makes sense. She is a messenger from this adjacent realm, one whose task is not to lure, but to warn. She bridges the worlds with her voice, reminding mortals of the nearness of the other world at the very moment they are about to cross into it. This connection also explains her indifference to distance. Families who emigrated across oceans still heard her cry when one of their own was dying. To the Aossi, space is not the barrier it is for mortals. Their world lies alongside ours, and the bonds of kinship cut through geography. For a spirit of the other world, a death in New York or Boston is no less audible than one in Limerick or Cork. The Banshee belongs to a realm where nearness is measured not in miles, but in ties of blood and fate. Her presence across continents is proof that she comes from a place beyond the ordinary rules of distance and time. The Aossi were not to be taken lightly, and neither was the Banshee. Just as people left offerings at fairy mounds or avoided angering the sea with disrespect, they treated her cry with seriousness. To mock her or to ignore her warning was to risk disaster. The wisdom of folklore insisted that one must acknowledge her, even if with fear, for she was not a random ghost, but a representative of the hidden world. Her cry was not only a signal of death, but also a reminder that the living are always being watched by the unseen, always sharing their land with powers greater than themselves. The IOC are often described as a mirror of human society. They had their own courts, wars, celebrations, and sorrows. If that is true, then the Banshee is their mirror of human grief. Just as families keened for their dead, so too did the other world keen for the passing of mortals. The two realms reflected one another, each acknowledging the other in times of loss. The Banshee is the clearest example of this reflection, a spirit who embodies the symmetry between human and otherworld mourning. Her lament shows that death is not only a human concern, but a cosmic one, echoing in both worlds. For the Irish imagination, the IOC were never far. Every hill and field carried their presence, every threshold was a place of potential contact. The Banshee, as one of their number, was both feared and accepted as part of the natural order. She belonged to that hidden realm just beneath the surface, but she stepped across whenever the veil thinned at the moment of death. To know her was to know that the other world was never distant, and that in every cry of grief there was an echo of something older and deeper than the human voice. When we listen closely to the traditions of the Banshee, echoes of something older begin to surface, an older figure whose shadow lingers in Irish myth, one whose presence is just as bound to death and fate. That figure is the Morrigan, the great phantom queen, goddess of battle, prophecy, and doom. The overlap between the Banshee and the Morrigan is striking. Both are women whose voices announce death. Both appear at river crossings, washing bloodied garments that foretell the end of warriors. Both embody transformation, shifting between maiden, crone, and terrible phantom, and both belong to that liminal space between life and death, standing not as executioners, but as heralds. The Morrigan is one of the most complex goddesses of Irish mythology, appearing in multiple guises across the sagas. She is at once a war goddess, a fate goddess, and a sovereignty figure. In the Tainbo Cuailnge, the epic of Cú Chulainn, she confronts the hero in various forms, offering both aid and doom, and ultimately washing his armor at a ford before his death. This image is virtually identical to the washer at the ford in later folklore, showing how the divine figure of the goddess may have been transformed over centuries into the folk image of the Banshee. The act of washing blood-stained clothes is not simply housekeeping, it is ritual preparation, a symbolic cleansing of what will soon be stained in battle. For warriors, to see such a woman was to know that fate itself had turned against them. The Morrigan is also a figure of voice. She shrieks over battlefields, her cries striking terror into soldiers and breaking their courage. She is the crow who caws above the dying, the scream that unsettles armies. The Banshee's cry is a gentler echo of this terrible sound, more sorrowful than terrifying, but still a voice that strips away human defenses and forces recognition of mortality. Where the Morrigan's voice scatters armies, the Banshee's cry pierces the night of the household. Both function in the same way, as voices that carry death before it arrives, voices that no one can ignore. The connection deepens when we consider the Morrigan's identity as a triple goddess. She is not one, but three, sometimes more, appearing in multiples that embody different aspects of womanhood and fate. In myth, she is often joined with Badby and Macha, forming a triad of war and death. Together, they embody the maiden, mother, and crone aspects that reappear in so many later traditions. The Banshee too wears these faces. She is sometimes young and radiant, sometimes aged and withered, sometimes maternal and sorrowful. She may even appear as a chorus, several women wailing together for the same death. These multiple identities reflect the same archetypal pattern. Death is not one thing, and the feminine figure who heralds it must be many to capture its fullness. In many ways, The banshee can be seen as the domesticated echo of the Morrigan. The goddess ruled over the fates of heroes and the outcomes of battles. Her influence stretched across kingdoms and clans. The banshee, by contrast, mourns not armies, but families. She narrows the scope of fate from the battlefield to the hearth, from the clash of nations to the deathbed of an ancestor. Yet the structure is the same. Where the Morrigan announced the doom of kings, the banshee announces the doom of lineages. Where the Morrigan shrieked above battle, the banshee wails outside cottages. Both are women of death whose power lies in prophecy and voice rather than direct action. This transformation from goddess to spirit reflects the broader shift in Irish belief as pagan mythology gave way to Christianized folklore. The gods did not vanish. They were reinterpreted, their roles fragmented and absorbed into new forms. The Morrigan's vast powers of fate and death may have filtered down into the figure of the banshee, retaining the core element of lament but stripping away the divinity. What remained was a supernatural mourner, no longer worshipped but still feared and respected. In this way, the banshee is not only a figure of folklore but a memory of older religion, a ghost of goddesses long past. Her echoes of the Morrigan also help explain her unsettling blend of fear and reverence. The Morrigan was never simply evil. She could aid as well as harm, protect as well as destroy. Her presence was terrifying, but it was also essential, for she revealed truths no one else could speak. The banshee inherits this ambiguity. Her cry terrifies, but it also consoles by acknowledging death. She is both dreadful and necessary, just as the Morrigan was. This balance of opposites, fear and comfort, dread and reverence, is the hallmark of liminal figures who embody truths that humans cannot otherwise confront. The crow, one of the Morrigan's forms, may even linger in the stories of the banshee. In some accounts, the banshee is not seen as a woman at all, but as a dark bird shrieking outside the house of the dying. This convergence shows how motifs shift over time. The goddess's crow becomes the spirit's cry, the battlefield omen becomes the household mourner. The essence is preserved even as the image changes. In linking the banshee to the Morrigan, we see how folklore does not forget. It transforms, adapts, softens, but never erases. The goddess of war becomes the spirit of lament. The triple queen becomes the many-faced mourner. The shriek over battlefields becomes the wail outside a cottage. And yet, through all these changes, the core remains. The female voice of fate, crying out at the threshold of death, marking the inevitability that no mortal can escape. Across Europe, the figure of a woman who announces death with her voice, her presence, or her ritual act is not unique to Ireland. The banshee has sisters scattered across the continent, each shaped by local traditions but carrying the same essence. The female herald of mortality, bound to families, clans, or warriors, who appears not to kill but to foretell and mourn. These parallels reveal that the banshee belongs to a wider human imagination, one that gave feminine form to the inevitability of death. In Scotland, stories of the Caoineag and the Bean Nye run almost parallel to those of the Irish banshee. The Caoineag, whose name simply means weeper, is described as an invisible spirit whose sobbing foretells the death of members of certain Highland clans. She is never seen, only heard, her wailing indistinguishable from human lament until the truth becomes clear. Like the Irish banshee, she attaches herself to families, her voice sounding only when their bloodline is touched by death. Closely related is the Bean Ní, the washerwoman, who is seen crouched by streams, washing bloodied garments that belong to those about to die. Anyone who approached her risked hearing the names of the doomed or even discovering their own fate. The resemblance to the washer at the ford in Irish tradition is too strong to ignore. Both cultures imagined women by rivers, performing the same grim act, heralding death not with swords or curses, but with water and lament. The Norse had their own counterparts in the Disir and the Valkyries. The Disir were female spirits connected to families who presided over birth and death alike, shaping the fates of individuals. They were honored in rituals and feared when omens suggested their displeasure. Like the Banshee, they were tied not to places, but to lineages, watching over the destinies of bloodlines across generations. The Valkyries, more famous in modern imagination, chose which warriors would die in battle and carried them to Odin's hall. Their role was not mourning but selection, yet their presence on the battlefield echoed the same truth. Death was not random, but marked, announced, and accompanied by female spirits whose voices and visions bridged the mortal and divine. Just as the Banshee cried at the deathbed, the Valkyrie appeared at the battlefield, both embodying the feminine power to declare the inevitable. In Welsh tradition, figures such as the Cyhyraeth bear striking similarities. The Cyhyraeth is described as a disembodied moaning or wailing, often heard before death or disaster. Those who heard it might also glimpse a spectral woman, thin and haggard, crying out along the banks of rivers. Her presence, like that of the Banshee, was never mistaken for ordinary sound. It was an omen, and once heard, it was followed inevitably by loss. Welsh tales also describe the Gwyrachod, witches who wail for the dying, blending the roles of supernatural mourner and feared crone. These figures show how the Celtic imagination, whether in Ireland, Scotland or Wales, consistently turned to the image of the wailing woman to embody the threshold of death. Further east, in Slavic lands, we find spirits whose voices announce mortality in their own distinctive ways. The Rusalka, though often thought of as a water nymph, sometimes takes on the role of a death omen, luring men to watery graves with her haunting songs. More directly, the Navka or Navi, spirits of the restless dead, were said to wail in forests or near rivers, their cries echoing the approach of death. In certain regions, women known as Placalishchi performed ritual lamentations at funerals, paralleling the Irish keeners. These human mourners, like their Irish counterparts, blurred into the supernatural when their cries were imagined as carrying beyond the grave. The Slavic traditions are filled with voices, both human and otherworldly, that functioned as bridges between life and death, reinforcing the universality of the image. Even in southern Europe, echoes of the Banshee appear. In parts of Italy, legends tell of the Piangenti, ghostly women who weep outside homes where death is imminent. In Spanish folklore, the La Llorona is remembered as a weeping woman tied to water, though her role has shifted more toward vengeance and tragedy. Still, the essence remains, the sound of a woman's lament in the night as a herald of death. What unites all these traditions is not the detail, but the structure. In every case, the feminine voice, whether wailing, washing, or moaning, becomes the marker of mortality. Death is announced not by drums or bells, but by cries that pierce the night, cries that come not from the living community, but from beyond it. These figures are almost always women, reflecting the deep cultural association of women with mourning. Across Europe, it was women who keened, who wept publicly, who carried grief into sound. It was natural then that when people imagined spirits of death, they imagined them as women whose cries carried from the other world into ours. The parallels also highlight the persistence of older mythologies, the washerwoman of Scotland, the Valkyrie of Norse myth, the wailing crone of Wales. All of these share roots with the same archetype of the fate-bearing woman. She is the one who announces, who selects, who cries out. The Banshee is Ireland's version of this archetype, moulded by local culture into the keener of noble families, but still part of a much larger pattern that spanned the continent. These sister spirits do not diminish her uniqueness. Instead, they show how deeply human the need was to give death a voice. Across cultures, people imagined that death was not silent but heralded, that its approach could be felt and heard before it arrived. They gave that voice to women, because women already embodied mourning in the human world. The banshee is part of this European chorus, one voice among many, but distinct in her attachment to bloodlines, her many faces, and her place in the Irish landscape. She belongs to Ireland, yet she also belongs to a shared human imagination that heard, in the cries of women, the sound of death drawing near. If there is one thing that defines the banshee beyond all else, it is her voice. Stories of her rarely linger on her appearance, which shifts from crone to maiden to phantom, but they dwell on her wail, describing it in terms that strain the limits of language. Witnesses say it is piercing, shrill, mournful, and unearthly. It is the sound of grief given shape, a lament that seems to carry both human sorrow and something far beyond it. And unlike weapons or curses, which strike once, her voice lingers, echoing in the mind of anyone who hears it, leaving them unsettled long after the sound has faded. In Irish imagination, this wail is not merely a symptom of her presence, it is her power itself. Sound carries an authority that vision does not. A ghost glimpsed at the edge of the eye can be dismissed as a trick of the light, but a cry heard in the night, unmistakable and undeniable, pierces directly into the listener's being. The banshee's wail leaves no doubt. It cannot be mistaken for the cry of an animal, nor confused with the wind. People describe it as uniquely human yet undeniably otherworldly, as though it belongs to both realities at once. It is a sound that does not simply enter the ear, but takes hold of the heart. That is why her cry is remembered even by those who never saw her form, why the stories of her voice are more consistent than the stories of her appearance. The power of her wail also lies in its timing. It comes not during the moment of death, nor after it, but before. It is prophecy in sound, a revelation that the end has already been sealed. For families, this made it terrifying. To hear the banshee was to know that grief was inevitable, that sorrow had already entered the household even if the loved one still breathed. This prophetic quality gave her cry a weight far greater than simple mourning. It was an omen, a sound that turned the future into the present. No one who heard it could cling to denial, for the voice stripped away illusions and forced recognition of mortality. In many traditions, sound itself is a supernatural weapon. The scream of the Morrigan shatters armies. The shout of gods in battle turns tides of war. Music enchants charms or curses. Words spoken in spells carry power to heal or to harm. The banshee's wail belongs to this tradition of sound as force. It does not kill, but it wounds certainty. It does not strike flesh, but it cuts through hope. By removing the shield of ignorance, it delivers a blow more lasting than steel. The living can recover from wounds of the body, but not from the knowledge of approaching death. The wail is a weapon of inevitability, one that leaves the listener defenseless against fate. Descriptions of the wail emphasize its inhuman quality. Some call it unbearably high-pitched, like glass shattering. Others describe it as low and keening, a sob stretched into eternity. Many say it shifts in tone, beginning as a cry of pain, turning into a chant, and fading into sobbing. Whatever its shape, it is always beyond the capacity of ordinary lungs. Those who hear it insist that no human throat could sustain such sound. This reinforces its supernatural power. The banshee's wail is not imitation, but the origin. Human keening at funerals may echo it, but her cry is the source from which mortal lament draws. It is not only families who feel the weight of her cry. In some accounts, strangers passing by a house at night have heard the banshee and felt the chill of her grief, even without knowing who she mourned. Soldiers on the eve of battle described her cry breaking over valleys, a sound that carried despair through entire ranks. In these stories, her voice has the effect of dissolving courage, draining strength, and sowing fear. This recalls her kinship with older war goddesses like the Morrigan, whose shrieks could rout armies. Though the banshee's voice is softer, more sorrowful than violent, it still carries the power to unmake resolve. No warrior can stand firm when reminded that fate has already claimed him. The link between sound and the other world was deeply rooted in Irish tradition. Music and poetry were seen as magical, capable of shaping reality. Poets, the Fillid, wielded their verses like spells, their words binding kings to honor and truth. Musicians could enchant listeners into sleep or frenzy. Against this backdrop, the banshee's wail makes perfect sense. It is the otherworld's poetry of death, a performance that shapes human hearts into acceptance of fate. Just as a poet's satire could ruin a reputation, the banshee's lament could unravel courage and certainty. Her cry is art and weapon combined, the most powerful form of expression at the most decisive moment of life. The fear of her cry was not simply fear of death itself, but fear of recognition. Humans spend their lives trying to keep mortality at the edge of awareness. We busy ourselves with work, with love, with daily routines, pretending that the end is far away. The banshee's wail tears down this defense in a single instant. It forces the listener to face what they would rather forget. This sudden confrontation with truth is why so many describe the sound as unbearable. It is not just noise, it is knowledge, carried on sound waves, knowledge that cannot be unseen or unheard once received. At the same time, the cry carries an odd kind of compassion. Those who heard it often said that beneath the terror there was sorrow, that the voice sounded not triumphant, but grieving. The banshee does not delight in announcing death, she mourns it. Her wail is a lament not only for the dying, but for the pain of those left behind. In this way, the cry is not a curse, but a recognition. It does not seek to destroy, but to acknowledge. Families, though horrified, sometimes took comfort in knowing that the other world mourned alongside them. The wail gave their sorrow weight, making it cosmic as well as personal. It is this dual nature, terrifying yet consoling, that makes the banshee's wail unique among supernatural sounds. It is not the howl of a wolf or the scream of a demon designed only to frighten, nor is it purely soothing. It straddles both, terrifying because it announces inevitability, consoling because it ensures no death goes unnoticed. Its power lies in that tension, in the way it embodies both the cruelty and the dignity of mortality. When all is considered, her voice is the essence of her being. She does not strike, she does not touch, she does not drag souls away, she cries. And in that cry lies everything: prophecy, omen, grief, compassion, and terror. It is the sound that makes the invisible visible, the intangible tangible, the future present. It is the supernatural weapon of sound, wielded not to kill, but to reveal. That is why, centuries after the first stories were told, people still shudder at the thought of hearing her in the night. The banshee is her wail, and her wail is the sound of death itself, carried on the wind to remind the living that fate is always nearer than they think. When Christianity spread across Ireland, it did not arrive into a void. The land was already filled with stories, rituals, and beliefs that had shaped people's lives for centuries. Spirits like the banshee were woven into daily reality, inseparable from the way families understood death and fate. For the church, this posed a problem. The voice of the banshee was not sanctioned, her role not recognized by doctrine, and yet she was everywhere in the minds of the people. The response was predictable. What had once been a respected mourner of the other world began to be recast as a dangerous spirit, her cry reinterpreted not as acknowledgement, but as temptation, not as lament, but as curse. The church emphasized the idea that death should be faced with prayer and sacrament, not with the wails of pagan spirits. The rituals of keening themselves, so closely tied to the banshee, drew suspicion. Priests condemned professional keeners, calling their chants excessive, indecent, and even demonic. The improvisational verses, which sometimes criticized landlords or invoked ancient figures, were especially troubling to authorities who sought to control religious expression. Against this backdrop, the banshee became a symbol of what the church opposed: death marked by uncontrolled voices, by women outside ecclesiastical authority, by spirits that did not answer to heaven. In sermons and moral tales, her cry was sometimes reinterpreted as the work of fallen angels or damned souls. Instead of a spirit mourning the dead, she became a fiend seeking to draw the living into despair. To hear her was framed not as receiving a supernatural warning, but as being tempted to lose faith, to surrender to fear instead of trusting in God's will. This reframing did not erase the old belief, but it layered it with suspicion. Families who once took pride in being followed by a banshee were told instead that such spirits marked them as vulnerable to the devil's influence. Some traditions softened this condemnation by recasting her as a soul trapped between worlds. In these versions, the banshee was said to be a woman who had committed a great sin, doomed to wander forever, weeping for others as penance for her own guilt. This explanation allowed people to keep the image of the weeping spirit while aligning it with Christian ideas of sin and redemption. She was no longer a neutral mourner, but a cautionary tale, a reminder of the consequences of transgression. Her lament was not only for the dead, but for herself, forever crying for the state of her own soul. Yet despite these efforts, the older associations never disappeared. People still described her with respect, even when they whispered that priests called her demonic. The persistence of her presence shows that she spoke to something deeper than official teaching. Death was not an abstract doctrine. It was a lived reality, and the banshee gave that reality a voice. Families could not silence her simply because the church disapproved. They continued to hear her, to fear her, and in some ways to welcome her as part of the natural order of dying. The clash between folklore and Christianity is especially visible in the tension around women's voices. The church valued silence, modesty, and obedience in women, while Keening and the banshee represented the opposite: loud, raw, uncontrolled expressions of grief. To condemn the banshee was, in part, to condemn women's public power in the rituals of death. Her voice, like the Keeners, refused to be contained. It spilled out into the night, ungoverned by liturgy, carrying grief that was too large for prayers alone. The demonization of the banshee reflects this discomfort with female agency in the space of mourning. Still, even within Christian Ireland, people found ways to reconcile the two worlds. Some claimed that the banshee was not demonic, but angelic, a fallen angel who had not followed Lucifer fully, but had also not remained in heaven. Condemned to wander the earth, she wept for the dying as a kind of eternal half-penance, her cry both sorrow and warning. This view made her less threatening, aligning her with the idea of purgatory, of spirits caught in between who could still perform meaningful acts for the living. By the 19th century, with the rise of written folklore collections, the image of the banshee had softened again. Even when described by Catholic storytellers, she was rarely portrayed as outright evil. Instead, she was framed as a mysterious figure, sometimes tragic, sometimes frightening, always inevitable. The demonization had not succeeded in erasing her older roles. It had only layered suspicion on top of them. For ordinary people, she remained what she had always been, the voice of death, mournful and terrifying, but neither angel nor demon, neither curse nor blessing. The story of how Christianity treated the banshee shows us how resilient folklore can be. Even under pressure from priests and moralists, even when labeled dangerous or sinful, the belief endured because it answered needs that doctrine did not. The banshee gave sound to grief, acknowledged families, and made mortality tangible. No amount of condemnation could take that away. She lived on in the whispers of mourners, in the cries heard at night, in the stubborn persistence of a people who refuse to let their imagination be silenced. When we strip away the layers of myth, folklore, and religious interpretation, what remains at the heart of the Banshee is something profoundly human. Her cry, her presence, her very identity embody truths about grief and mortality that every person eventually faces. This is why she endures, why people who may not believe in spirits or fairies still find themselves unsettled at the idea of her wail. She is not simply a ghostly woman at the window. She is the personification of loss itself, a symbol that gives form to the emotions we struggle to name when confronted with death. The first psychological truth she embodies is inevitability. The Banshee never causes death, she only announces it. In this way, she represents the reality that death cannot be bargained with, cannot be avoided once it has drawn near. Humans spend much of life trying to push this truth aside, burying it beneath routines, ambitions, and distractions. But the Banshee cuts through that denial with a single cry. To hear her is to be forced into recognition. Someone will die, and there is nothing to be done. The terror of her voice is not that she brings death, but that she removes the illusion of control. She symbolizes the shattering moment when we realize our helplessness before mortality. At the same time, her cry also reflects the necessity of grief. In cultures where mourning was loud, visible, and communal, grief was not hidden away. It was voiced, screamed, and wailed until the air itself carried it. The Banshee embodies this practice in supernatural form. She is grief externalized, a voice that gives shape to the inexpressible. Families who heard her may have feared her, but they also recognized that her cry was their own, magnified and anticipated. Psychologically, this gave them permission to mourn, to acknowledge the depth of their sorrow. Even today, when silence often surrounds death, the figure of the Banshee resonates as a reminder that grief demands expression. Suppressed sorrow does not disappear. It lingers until given voice. She is that voice. There is also a deeper symbolism in her many forms. As maiden, mother, and crone, she reflects the stages of life itself. To see her as a young woman is to confront the fragility of youth, the truth that even vitality can be cut short. To see her as a mother is to face the inevitability of losing those we love most dearly, of children predeceasing parents, or of families torn apart. To see her as an old woman is to witness the culmination of time, the body bent by years, the sorrow that comes with outliving others. In each guise, she mirrors a different aspect of mortality, showing us that death is not confined to one stage, but shadows every moment of life. Psychologically, this gives her a universality that no single form could capture. She is the face of mortality at every age, the mourner who knows every sorrow. Her attachment to families also carries psychological weight. Death is not only the end of an individual, but a wound to the continuity of kinship. The Banshee does not appear for strangers, she appears for blood. This emphasizes the way grief is bound to belonging. We mourn not just because life has ended, but because relationships have been severed, because our place in a web of family and ancestry has been torn. By tying herself to bloodlines, the Banshee dramatizes this truth. She cries not for one life in isolation, but for the entire lineage affected by its loss. She is the voice of communal grief, the echo of sorrow that runs through generations. Another truth she embodies is anticipation. One of the most difficult psychological states humans endure is waiting for death, knowing it is near but not yet arrived. Families keeping vigil for the sick, soldiers anticipating battle, loved ones fearing the worst. These moments are filled with tension, dread, and helplessness. The Banshee's cry captures this state perfectly. She does not cry after the fact, but before, when the outcome is certain but not yet complete. Her voice is the sound of that unbearable anticipation, of mourning already begun while life still lingers. In this way, she personifies not only grief but anxiety, the weight of knowing what cannot be stopped. Her role also reflects the psychological process of projection. Humans often make sense of overwhelming emotions by imagining them outside the self. Instead of saying, "I feel grief so powerful it feels like another presence," folklore creates another presence, a spirit who grieves aloud. The banshee may be understood as a projection of the human need to externalize sorrow, to give it a body and a voice. By locating grief in her, people could make sense of its intensity, recognizing it as something real, tangible, and outside themselves, even though it was born from within. Her dual nature, terrifying yet consoling, also speaks to the paradox of grief. To lose someone is to be devastated, to feel a pain so deep it is almost unbearable. And yet, in that very pain lies the proof of love, the recognition that the life mattered. Grief is both wound and tribute. The banshee embodies this paradox. Her cry chills the blood, but it also validates the sorrow. She terrifies by heralding death, but she consoles by ensuring no death passes without recognition. Psychologically, this is exactly how grief functions, as both agony and acknowledgement, both destructive and affirming. In modern terms, one might see her as the unconscious given form. She is the voice of what people already know but cannot admit. A family senses that their loved one is fading, but it is easier to imagine that the banshee has spoken than to confront their own recognition. Her cry articulates what the human heart perceives, but the mind resists. In this way, she remains relevant even for those who no longer believe in spirits. She is the figure we imagine when we finally allow ourselves to hear what has always been true. The endurance of the banshee in Irish imagination is not simply a matter of superstition. It is a testament to how deeply she embodies the psychological realities of grief and mortality. Her cry is the sound of inevitability, of sorrow, of anticipation, of the projection of unbearable feelings. She is terrifying because she reveals what we deny, but she is also consoling because she gives voice to what we cannot say. As long as humans live with death, and we always will, the banshee will continue to haunt us, not just as a figure of folklore, but as a symbol of the truths we all carry within. The banshee was never confined to whispered tales by the hearth. From the earliest days of oral storytelling to the emergence of Irish literature, she found her place in every medium that gave voice to the imagination of the island. What began as folklore, voices in the night, sightings by rivers, warnings carried down family lines, slowly entered poetry, prose, and drama, until the banshee was not only a figure of belief, but a character of art. This transition is as important as the tales themselves, because it shows how the banshee was not frozen in tradition, but constantly reinterpreted, reshaped, and retold to fit the needs of new generations. In the oral tradition, she appears in countless fireside stories collected during the 18th and 19th centuries by folklorists who realized that the voices of the people were in danger of being lost. These accounts, often gathered in rural communities, describe her in vivid detail. The woman crying outside a cottage, the washer at the ford, the lament that carried across valleys. The repetition of these motifs gave the banshee an authority that written accounts could not invent. She lived in the rhythms of oral storytelling, in the variations that shifted from county to county, each teller adding or subtracting details, but always preserving the core, a wailing woman whose cry meant death. When Irish poets began writing in English during the 18th century, the banshee entered their verse. Writers such as Thomas Crofton Croker and later W.B. Yeats saw in her not only a remnant of folklore, but a symbol of Ireland itself. Yeats, in particular, drew on her image to express themes of sorrow, inevitability, and national loss. For him, the banshee was not just a mourner of individuals, but a mourner of a nation, her cry echoing the grief of a people bound by colonization and displacement. In this way, she became both personal and political, her wail representing not only the fate of families, but the fate of Ireland as a whole. Folklore collections of the 19th century often romanticized her, presenting her not as a terrifying omen, but as a mysterious, almost gentle presence. Writers eager to capture the Celtic twilight emphasized her beauty, her ethereal nature, her tragic dignity. This literary reshaping softened her edges, making her less a figure of dread and more a character of melancholy. Such portrayals appealed to Victorian audiences who were fascinated by the supernatural, but preferred their ghosts tinged with sadness rather than horror. The Banshee fit this role perfectly. She became a spectral emblem of the Irish landscape, a voice that tied the living to their ancestors, sorrowful but not malevolent. At the same time, she appeared in Gothic literature, where her wail carried the weight of horror. Writers used her to heighten atmosphere, her cry piercing the night as an unmistakable sign that death was near. In these stories, she became part of the wider European Gothic tradition, alongside vampires, spectres, and omens. Yet even here, she retained her uniqueness. Unlike other Gothic monsters, she did not seek to harm or consume. She remained a herald, a mourner, a voice rather than a hand. This made her an ideal figure for building tension, for filling pages with dread that could not be easily resolved. The Banshee's transition into literature also reflects the way Ireland sought to preserve its identity. Folklore was not merely entertainment, but a marker of cultural distinctiveness. To write of the Banshee was to write of something uniquely Irish, a figure no English tale could replicate. This cultural role gave her endurance in writing long after belief in her literal presence had waned. Even when urban audiences no longer expected to hear her cry in the night, they recognized her as part of the inheritance of Irish imagination. She also appeared in plays and ballads, often as a symbol of foreboding or tragedy. In these forms, her cry was sometimes dramatized by human actors imitating keening, reminding audiences of the thin line between folklore and lived ritual. The sound of a human wail on stage could evoke the presence of the Banshee without her ever appearing in person, allowing her to haunt the story without being seen. This reflected her role in folklore as well. She was more often heard than seen, more presence than figure. In modern literature, the Banshee continues to appear, though often in reimagined form. Writers use her as a metaphor for trauma, memory, or suppressed grief. She is invoked in stories of the diaspora, her cry echoing across oceans to remind emigrants of the homeland they left behind. In some novels, she becomes a voice of feminine rage, her wail symbolizing the silenced grief of women throughout history. In others, she retains her traditional role as the omen of death, a sound that chills characters and readers alike. This adaptability shows her resilience as a symbol. She can shift from folklore to politics, from horror to metaphor, always carrying with her the essence of mourning. What is remarkable is how seamlessly she moves between oral tale and written page. In folklore, she is immediate, a presence people swear they have heard. In literature, she becomes reflective, a symbol open to interpretation. Yet in both forms, she remains the same at her core, the voice of death, crying for what must be lost. Irish storytelling, whether spoken in cottages or written in books, has always needed her. She is the sound of grief made audible, the link between personal sorrow and cultural identity, the mourner who ensures that no death, whether of a person, a clan, or a nation, passes unacknowledged. Even as belief in the literal presence of the Banshee has faded, her cry continues to echo in the modern world. She has never disappeared from the Irish imagination. She has only changed shape, moving from the lanes and cottages of folklore into the mediums of music, film, and popular culture. Today, people may not listen at night for her wail in the fields, but they still hear her in songs, see her in films, and recognize her instantly when she appears in stories. The banshee has become one of Ireland's most enduring cultural symbols, reshaped for new audiences while keeping her essence intact. In music, she appears both directly and indirectly. Traditional ballads sometimes invoke her, describing the cry that foretells tragedy. In folk songs, her name is used to embody sorrow so profound it must be supernatural. More recently, musicians in Ireland and beyond have drawn on her image as a metaphor for grief, rage, or the inevitability of loss. Rock bands have used Banshee as a song title, jazz musicians have borrowed the name for haunting instrumental tracks, and contemporary Irish artists still reference her in lyrics that link personal pain with cultural memory. Her cry, even when not described literally, has become shorthand for emotional intensity, a sound that cannot be contained in ordinary words. In literature of the modern era, she is often reimagined to suit the anxieties of the time. In Gothic revival writing, she remained the omen of death, but in post-colonial literature, her wail was sometimes interpreted as the cry of Ireland itself, a nation mourning its dead, its losses, its displacements. In the diaspora, her voice carried across oceans, appearing in stories of Irish immigrants who still heard echoes of the homeland through her lament. Even outside Irish writing, the banshee became recognizable enough to be borrowed into fantasy novels, where she stands alongside vampires and werewolves as part of the international lexicon of the supernatural. Film and television have done much to spread her image. In Irish cinema, she is sometimes treated with reverence, a nod to the seriousness of her folklore roots. Internationally, she often appears as a horror figure, her scream used as a chilling effect. Movies and shows aimed at younger audiences tend to exaggerate her features, turning her into a terrifying hag with a deadly shriek. But these portrayals, while far from the subtlety of folklore, keep her name alive. In fantasy series and video games, she is often an enemy whose scream damages or kills, a direct evolution of the folklore belief in the unbearable power of her voice. Though simplified, this adaptation highlights the same core truth. Her identity is inseparable from sound, and that sound is always linked with death. Comics and graphic novels have also embraced her. She appears as both villain and tragic figure, sometimes a monstrous wailer, sometimes a misunderstood spirit. Writers and artists play with her multiple faces, the crone, the maiden, the phantom, to give her visual form. In superhero comics, characters inspired by her often wield sonic powers, their cries weaponized into destructive force. This reflects a modern reinterpretation of her wail, shifting from omen to active attack, but still grounded in the idea that her voice is supernatural and unstoppable. Popular culture has even taken her name as metaphor. Sports teams, roller coasters, and businesses have adopted Banshee as a title, using it to evoke intensity, fear, or raw energy. This secularization strips away much of her cultural depth, but it proves how recognizable she's become. People may not know every detail of her folklore, but they know enough to associate her with a scream, with power, with something unforgettable. In this way, she has moved from the world of belief into the world of symbol, where she functions as cultural shorthand for what is haunting, inevitable, and overwhelming. Yet in Ireland itself, she still carries weight as more than a horror trope. Modern storytellers, poets, and musicians continue to treat her with respect, drawing on her as a figure of heritage and continuity. Some use her to explore themes of generational grief, linking the old laments of keening with modern struggles of loss and memory. Others reinterpret her as a feminist figure, her uncontrollable voice standing as a symbol of women's expression in a society that often silenced them. In this reading, her scream is not only about death, but about the refusal to be quiet, the insistence that grief and rage must be heard. This evolution shows how flexible the banshee remains. She can be ghost, omen, metaphor, or icon, always shaped to the needs of those who invoke her. Even in tourism and heritage, she has found her place. Ghost tours in Irish cities invoke her cry as part of their repertoire, blending entertainment with tradition. Museums and cultural centres include her among the cast of Irish folklore figures, reminding visitors that Ireland's identity is steeped in voices from the other world. Children still hear her stories in classrooms and storybooks, and her name is passed on not only as myth, but as a cultural marker. The banshee has become a bridge between old and new, folklore and modern identity, Ireland and the world. Her persistence in music, film, and popular culture shows that she remains as relevant now as she was centuries ago. People may no longer fear her outside their windows, but they still understand her symbol. She is grief, inevitability, the power of sound to break through silence. Whether in a folk ballad, a horror film, a fantasy novel, or a metaphor for rage and sorrow, the banshee continues to wail in the modern imagination. Her voice has never been silenced, it has only changed its audience. The cry of the banshee, whether imagined as a shriek in the night, a lament by the river, or a chorus echoing across hills, is more than folklore. It is a lesson, one that Ireland has carried for centuries, one that resonates far beyond its shores. The banshee teaches us about death, not as a remote abstraction, but as something intimate, personal, and unavoidable. She teaches us about memory, about how the living must acknowledge and carry the weight of those who have gone. And above all, she teaches us about mourning, the enduring spirit of grief that refuses to be silenced. At the most basic level, her cry is a reminder of inevitability. Death comes to kings and to farmers, to young and old, to those prepared and those taken suddenly. The banshee does not discriminate. She does not judge. Her cry sounds for the noble houses, but it also echoes in stories of common folk who stumble upon her. In this way, she embodies the truth that mortality spares no one. To hear her is to confront what every human knows, yet spends a lifetime avoiding, that the end is certain, and it can come at any time. In a world where so much feels uncertain, this is the one certainty she never lets us forget. But she also teaches us that death is not silence. Her cry insists that loss must be recognized, that the passing of a life is not an invisible event. In communities where keening once filled the air, grief was never hidden. It was a public act voiced and shared. The banshee extends this principle into the supernatural. Her cry is not for her alone. It is for the family, for the community, for the world to hear. It says, "This life mattered. This death changes things. This sorrow deserves sound." In a modern age that often treats death as something to be contained, whispered about, or pushed to the margins, her cry stands as a rebuke. Mourning must be heard. Grief must have voice. Her persistence across centuries also shows how memory functions. Families claimed her as their own, saying she followed their bloodlines, crying for each death across generations. In this way, she became the custodian of lineage, the witness to continuity and change. When one member of a family died, she did not mourn only the individual, but the history that flowed through them. Her cry was for ancestry itself, for the living chain that connected past and present. She reminds us that mourning is never only about one person. It is about the place they held in the network of kinship, the stories they carried, the memory they leave behind. The banshee also teaches us about the value of expression. Her cry is raw, unrestrained, impossible to ignore. It mirrors the human need to keen, to sob, to wail when words fail. In this way, she validates grief as something that cannot and should not always be contained. To weep loudly, to let the world hear, is not weakness, but truth. The banshee, feared though she may be, embodies this truth. She is grief personified, and in her we see that the deepest sorrows are not meant to be silenced, but to be voiced, carried on the air like her lament. She carries lessons too about the complexity of mourning. Her cry is terrifying because it heralds loss, but it is also consoling because it ensures that loss is recognized. She embodies the paradox that grief itself is both wound and healing. To mourn is to feel pain, yet to mourn also affirms love and memory. The Banshee shows us that mourning is not the opposite of life, but part of it, an enduring spirit that gives meaning to our connections. Her cry is dreadful, but without it, death would pass unmarked and grief would be lonely. In her voice, sorrow becomes shared, and in sharing, it becomes bearable. Even in modern times, when few expect to hear her outside the window, the Banshee still lingers as a symbol. She is invoked in songs, stories, and films because she speaks to something timeless: the need to face death honestly, the need to give grief expression, the need to remember those who have gone. Her cry continues to echo because these needs never vanish. We may dress them differently, explain them in new ways, but the essence remains the same. Death is always near, memory always matters, mourning always endures. What the Banshee ultimately teaches is that mortality is not just an end, but a passage. Her place on thresholds, at doors, at rivers, at crossroads, shows that death is not silence, but transition. Her cry marks that crossing, reminding us that every death is both an ending and a continuation, a loss for the living but a movement into another realm. Whether one believes in the Ios Sea, in heaven, or in nothing beyond, the symbolism is powerful. The cry does not erase the pain of death, but it gives it dignity, acknowledging the passage and binding it into story. The endurance of her image proves how deeply she speaks to the human condition. For centuries, through pagan belief, Christian condemnation, folklore, literature, and pop culture, the Banshee has survived. She has changed faces, changed voices, but she has never been silenced. She endures because she is not just a ghost in Irish fields. She is the voice of grief itself, the reminder of death's inevitability and mourning's necessity. She endures because every generation, no matter how modern, still needs a way to give sorrow a voice. And so, the cry of the Banshee remains. It is the echo of inevitability, the affirmation of memory, the enduring spirit of mourning. It is terrifying because it reminds us of what we would rather forget, and yet it consoles because it ensures we do not forget. In her cry lies the final lesson, that death must be faced, that grief must be expressed, and that memory carried in voice binds the living to the dead. The Banshee does not vanish because these truths do not vanish. As long as there are humans to mourn, there will be a need for her cry, carrying on the wind, teaching us still what it means to live, to lose, and to remember.